Edson Cabalfin is an educator, architect, designer, curator, and historian. He is an inaugural Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the School of Architecture at Tulane University, where he concurrently serves as a director of the Social Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship Program and professor of Practice and Design Thinking. He was a curator of the Philippine Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018. He received his PhD in History of Architecture and Urban Development from Cornell University in 2012. Under a Fulbright Fellowship, he obtained his Master's of Science in Architecture degree from the University of Cincinnati in 2003. Edson's research in the last 2 decades have focused on the interdisciplinary and transnational intersections of architecture, history and theory, cultural studies, gender and sexuality studies, post-colonial theory, Southeast Asian studies, spatial justice, public interest design, heritage conservation. He wrote the book, What Kids Should Know About Filipino Architecture, and edited the book, The City Who Had Two Navels, official catalog of the Philippine Pavilion 16th Venice Architecture Biennale. A licensed and registered architect in the Philippines, Edson also runs his design consultancy, Brown Workshop, based in New Orleans and Manila, with projects in architecture, interior design, set design, costume design, fashion design, exhibition design, graphic design, and design strategy in North America, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Middle East in the last 25 years. So I will go ahead and pass it on to you, Edson, so you could continue on with your presentation portion of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you so much to the AIAS for inviting me to this important panel. And I'm happy to just share my research. And let me just quickly start and share my screen. Can you see my screen? Great. Thank you. So for this very brief presentation, I'd like to talk about a research that I've done entitled Rampa, Queer Sex Surveillance and Spectacle at the Quezon Memorial Circle in the Philippines. And by the way, greetings, I'm in Manila, the Philippines currently. So it's very appropriate that I'm talking about this space in the Philippines. But the term that I start with is the idea of rampa, which is actually coming from Spanish, a Spanish word that refers to like a ramp or like a runway. But in the Philippines in particular, and in gay slang, rampa refers to that of as an act of cruising or to go out and to show yourself. Just like in a fashion show. So the term ramampa refers to that of this act of cruising, particularly amongst queer folks in the Philippines. But I'm focusing just to present this idea of queer space also and how it relates to the city by this idea of what is the sort of this connection between sexuality and space. When I noticed a particular phenomenon that's happening in a particular space in the Philippines, and so I was asking the question, why was it that there were male sex workers around Quezon Memorial Circle, a particular space in the Philippines? And I'll quickly talk about that. The context of this space is in Quezon City, which I'm actually in right now, which was the erstwhile capital city of the Philippines between 1948 and 1976. And this research that I did was composed of fieldwork and interviews back in 2000 to 2001, and then later on again in 2007, 2008. So I would like to also then clarify that this phenomenon is already like 20 years old, and it actually has changed. And Quezon City, just to contextualize, is part of the National Capital Region here. This is the Philippines. Manila here is in the red box, and then on the right shows you the Metro Manila, which is the larger sort of city. And Quezon City is on the upper northeast corner of the city of the metro area. But I'm focusing on the zone here in the heart of Quezon City. And you can notice this sort of diamond shape and then this circle, which is actually a roundabout, a major roundabout in the heart of the city, which is the Quezon Memorial Circle. And you can see here an aerial photograph. This is a large roundabout that connects about 5 roads coming from different zones from the city. In the middle, you will notice that there is the monument, which is actually the place where the former President Manuel Quezon is buried. But this is a major site of intersection in the city. And I was particularly interested in looking at this phenomenon of sex workers, male sex workers in particular, who were known to be around this area. And they were known to be specifically located and standing under the lampposts and under the trees around the circle or the roundabout. And so I was interested in, to understand like why were they there and sort of like what was the connection. It was also quite known that the male sex workers were mostly they were patronized by male gay folks. And the women were also then going there, but it was primarily for gay male patrons. Female prostitutes and sex workers were actually in a different part of the city, so which is also an interesting sort of dynamic, but I'm not going to talk about it today. And so what's interesting about this circle, that this is a large public space, but then it's quite clear that there's actually paid gay sex that's happening outside the circle. And there's like a particular time frame that's happening between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. And just to understand that prostitution is illegal in the Philippines. And what's interesting here also is that then the male sex workers are standing in front of very particular zones around this circle. And they're standing in front of some of these key areas, including the Quezon City Hall and some institutional buildings, because around this roundabout are government agencies. So again, because it's in the heart of the city. And so here's just a map, just a diagram to show you where they're standing in particular, where they would frequent, including the Quezon City Hall, which is number 1. You can see number 8 and number 7, which is the National Housing Authority, and HUDC, which is the Housing and Urban Development Council. The roundabout flows one way, counterclockwise, and it follows basically like the American system of driving. And so it's just interesting that they're standing around this area, and that then patrons, what they would do is that then they would drive around, and then they would then stop at some of these key spaces, including in front of the Quezon City Hall, and the male sex workers would then approach the cars and talk to the prospective clients, and then if the clients and if the sex worker and the client agree, then they would the sex worker would then ride with the client, and then they would go around this major roundabout. Again, there's kind of like this very interesting sort of choreography also that happens when they go around. But I think like for me, like what's interesting here is also that these spaces are public spaces. The front, here's a picture of Quezon City Hall because it's one of the area where they would stand. It's a major public space. It's also a major transport node. People get on and off of public transport here in buses. So it's a major space, and yet the sex workers chose this area particularly because of sort of this ability to move in and out of visibility, because they can kind of blend within the people who are just sort of traveling and not draw attention to themselves because they are in front of a government building, a major, and there's like a police station behind this city hall. And yet they purposely also sort of stand here to be able to get clients. Again, because I don't have enough time, I'll just sort of like I'll just sort of leave with the idea that then this queer space that I'm sort of like looking at, it's just interesting to point out that then sometimes public spaces such as this major roundabout are planned in kind of a different way, you know, for a different intention, and yet like for example, queer folks appropriate these spaces for their purposes, and that then they are also spaces and sort of acts of subversion, you know, as the sex workers are standing in front of these sort of like government agencies in a major open public space, and yet they found this space to be the place where they're able to do their work and also to sort of appropriate them for their own purposes. And so I'll end with this sort of case study, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edson, for that presentation. Up next, we have Chris. So a brief introduction about Chris. Chris grew up in Austin, Texas, beautiful Barton Hills, land taken by force from the Tonkawa people by settler colonialists who believed themselves to be white. Chris graduated from the Liberal Arts and Science Academy, a public magnet high school on the Lyndon B. Johnson campus in Northeast Austin, where he first became involved in efforts to question and challenge segregation on the basis of race, encouraged by his teachers' family's own experience as white Jews in the American South. In 2012, Chris moved to New Orleans and attended Tulane University. As a student, he served as vice president of the Multicultural Arts and Architecture Collective and organized with students organizing against racism, Divest Tulane, and the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students, NOMAS-TU. Chris was also elected to leadership positions with the Tulane College Democrats and the American Institute of Architecture students. He graduated in 2017 with a Master's of Architecture and a major in political science. Today, Chris advocates, researches, and designs collaboratively as a facilitator of the Collaborative Design Workshop, where he aims to engage racialized cultural and political spaces through an anti-racist queer feminist lens. In the past, he has coordinated programming, content, and communications for the American Institute of Architects, New Orleans chapter, and the New Orleans Architecture Foundation, and contributed to Collaborative Design's efforts to design spaces for racial, social, and cultural equity. He serves on the board of the National Organization of Minority Architects, Louisiana chapter, as well as the Architecture Design Film Festival, New Orleans. To you, Chris, to take it away.
There we go. I'm not on mute anymore. All right. So thank you for the introduction, Victor. It's really wonderful to be here with you all this evening. This is quite an honor. And yeah, just to start off with a little, got a better introduction than I think I had remembered. I had sent in so much detail. So I don't really have much more to say here, other than that growing up in Texas, and even so liberal a city as Austin as it was considered to be, I grew up off a street called Robert E. Lee Road, named for a Confederate general. That's American culture. That's white American culture, is living in a liberal city and growing up in a place that's marked by white supremacy so deeply in a way that nobody talks about. Going to a segregated high school, not necessarily because there was no Black students at my high school, but because they were separated into classes where I got like the better teachers with more pay as a white student. Their classes that Black students had were tracked for more like competency programs and not like the better funded ones. So as Victor mentioned, yeah, and I think I'd actually put a typo in there. my teachers encouraged me to talk to my grandparents, which I think was a very important part of like sort of my own identity development, is that my grandparents were white Jews growing up in the South on my mom's side in the early 1920s and 1930s. And so once I was encouraged by my teachers to talk to them about what that experience was like, I became more conscious of, the world around me and how it hadn't changed that much in many ways. Usually when I show this slide, I don't talk about having grown up queer in Austin. And I guess that's because I really didn't in a lot of ways. I didn't come out until I went to college in New Orleans. So Austin for me also has that interesting meaning of like, I never really got to experience being queer and living there. I've only sort of seen it as I come back. And I do a lot of stuff in New Orleans, arguably to some people, shout out to my boyfriend, too many things. Victor gave some of my organizations I work with. There's been even more since I wrote that bio. And somehow I didn't put on that bio, I think it was a little older, that my actual job is as a visiting assistant professor of design thinking at Tulane's Taylor Center, which means Edson's my boss, which is amazing. In a real serious way, like Edson's the first queer boss I've ever had. And when I want to like talk about queer stuff in my curriculum as a teacher, Edson's like, cool, do it. Here's some more queer stuff you can talk about. And that's really, really like been an amazing experience so far. And speaks to the importance not only of representation, but of like power in a way, like people being in decision-making positions within institutions. What that means. So yeah, in addition to my work at Tulane as a professor, researcher, I run a small advocacy practice called the Collaborative Design Workshop, where a lot of what I do is consulting and then facilitation education projects. Never by myself, that's the name, collaborative. So I'm going to talk about values in design here and how values are embedded in design. This is a visual language called Adinkra. It's created by the Ashanti people of present-day Ghana, probably about 500 years ago. And that's important because that means it was brought by people from West Africa who were enslaved by Europeans to the United States. It's a visual language, so it wasn't able to be suppressed necessarily in the same way that a lot of written and spoken languages from West Africa were. And it was carried to New Orleans, the place where I've been educated about design, the place where I live, the place where I built my communities, where you can see it embedded in ironwork in the French Quarter and in much more working class neighborhoods as well, particularly this symbol here, Sankofa. We read it as a heart, sort of in our visual iconography, but what it means in the Akan iconography of the Adinkra symbols is go back and get it. So it communicates the importance of history, the necessity of carrying history with us as we move forward into the future. I'll argue a little bit later in this, that's a queer value too. It's a really necessary thing for us to do as queer people, as queer designers. We can see this abstracted design motif of the symbols in the ironwork from the 19th century created by enslaved craftsmen in New Orleans and other places in contemporary buildings that you might recognize, like the museum in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. by Freelan Ajay Bond. So I'd take a lot of my inspiration in my design thinking, design justice education work from collectives and movements which reference history. One of those more recently is Black Space. It's an urbanist collective organized kind of in 2015 to the present. And they created their own set of Adinkra kind of for the present day. And this visual language that ties into these values that they want to see expressed in work. And one of my favorites is kind of a translation of the Sankofa Adinkra, reckon with the past to build the future. But definitely recommend checking out Black Space and their manifesto. It's kind of a good, I kind of use it as like a cheat sheet of like, well, I can just look at this one thing and think like, are my projects doing these things, or the projects I'm working with people to develop doing these things. It's a set of values that's important to carry and easy to carry with. Well, not easy to do it, but easy to reference. I do a little bit of illustration myself, have worked on some public art and public history projects, and in 2020 got the opportunity to do this cartoon for a magazine. Again, as I present this, I don't usually point out that it includes an implied queer characters and a queer relationship. But as I was drawing it, I drew a straight couple, and I was like, you know what? Why does it have to be a straight couple? It could also be a queer couple. Which, I don't know. I maybe in my own use of queerness in my design work, it isn't always possible to do it in the most explicit ways. So I do try and do it in implicit ways when I can too. And that's often how we have to end up doing it. I am, of course, a white cis gay man. And so I think as I talk about so many of these design practices, which many of them have to do pretty intimately with race, Blackness and anti-Blackness, I think it's really important to kind of state that and throw out some of my own definitions and thinking about what racism is, what whiteness is, what white queerness is specifically. And I think I broaden that here to white cis heteropatriarchy, of which white, queer, and gay men are very often upholding through the ways we exist, the ways we are exclusive in how we occupy space, especially queer space, and also the ways that we design. And the definition of racism I'm using here is from the abolitionist thinker Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Racism is the state-sanctioned production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. Some of y'all might know Gilmore from her work on called The Golden Gulag. It's a book about the development of the prison industrial complex in California, but also from the Twitter account Ruth Wilson Gilmore Girls, which I definitely recommend checking out as well. It just takes her work and puts it in a very easily shareable way of like quotes like this. This is sort of some of my own thinking on where my freedom and my liberation as a queer person comes from. I know that the degrees of freedom and liberation I have as a white cis gay man in the US today are the result of Black, queer, trans, feminist, womanist, and decolonial liberation struggles rooted in resistance to enslavement, Jim Crow, colonization, cis heteropatriarchy. And I know that there is no queer liberation, there is no queer space without Black liberation, without Black space, and many other forms of liberation. And that I think that there are, not to call anyone in particular out, there is like a robust discourse on especially like queer space and design. There's a book called Queer Space that's been around. It was written by a famous guy who I won't name for a while. And I get so bothered that like he's the only person people go to asking for what queer space is. And it's usually whatever white cis gay men are doing. And I'm tired of it. That's the reason I'm so glad that we're all here, not all being white cis gay men talking about where white cis gay men have sex in New York. Anyway. What I'm gonna go on for the rest of this is some slides from a collaborative presentation workshop I developed with my friend Morgan Aguilard a couple years ago. I'll go through it a little faster than it's supposed to because I know we don't have much time, but it's basically theorizing, presenting some examples of Black and queer architecture and planning. So making some definitions out there. What are some ways that we characterize Blackness and queerness in spatial ways? Celebration, cultural expression, right to the city, love, joy, making and creating. In this example, sort of a riff off of the queer poet June Jordan's works by Professor Charles Davis from the University of Buffalo. And then sort of the other side of that dynamic is violence, erasure, threatening, destruction, physical and psychological injury. And this is a protest organized at a Pride March in 2017 in Washington, D.C., where Black Lives Matter protesters at a Pride March were being brutalized by police for jumping into this space without a permit to object to murders of Black queer people. So self-determination is a really important part of liberation struggles. It's a long quote from Bell Hooks that I won't read in its entirety, but definitely recommend checking out Black Vernacular Architecture as Cultural Practice, a short little essay that she wrote, which goes very deeply into sort of what self-determination can look like in a design sense, and rooting it in practices of poor rural Black folks like her own family, but also it's not just exclusive to, it's not only a practice that can be done by people who fit into that set of descriptors, that it's a practice of liberation that can, with thoughtful reflection, consideration, be practiced more broadly too. And of course, many of us have heard of the Combahee River Collective and their manifesto from the early 1970s, sort of defining what we now know of as Black feminism and identity politics in its original conception. Me sort of reading this and interacting with this as a white cis man has also been a process of both knowing where it is my space to be in and organizing, knowing where it's not my space to be in and organizing, but also recognizing that my own liberation as a white person is tied up in my ability to root this not in participating in someone else's struggle, but struggling for my own humanity as a white person by deconstructing whiteness, deconstructing capitalism, deconstructing the oppressive systems that I'm a part of, that I've been trained to uphold. So knowing that, and one way I do that, it's real important, is by like relating it back to my own family's histories, knowing that like my family, particularly the ones in the South, like they were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe before they became white in the late 19th, early 20th centuries by expressing anti-Blackness to benefit from being white in America. But they weren't always white, and we don't always have to be white for the entirety of the rest of history, but we have to struggle against whiteness. So to that idea of like memory marking, bringing history with us, this is a pretty famous monument, probably one of the more, well, Stonewall itself is like maybe the most famous queer monument in the United States, but the statues outside are also pretty well known. They were put up in the 1990s, I think, funded by some wealthy cis white men investment bankers, and many have said that they whitewashed the history of Stonewall by presenting four cis white people sort of as the figures of Stonewall. And I do think it is cool how activists often reappropriate these by painting them and dressing them up, sort of to illustrate the true history, to fight back against the whitewashing. It's an illustration that like even queer memory marking, even queer monuments can also be oppressive if they literally whitewash the true history. As we know, Stonewall was led by Black and queer people, the uprising in 1969. Real cool little piece of history is I have spent some time both in architecture and development as well, and kind of come to understand like what we do as architects is only possible because developers make it so. That there have been artists and designers who participated in things like bringing beautiful design, beautiful art to public housing in the United States. Back in the 1930s, Richmond Barthay, a Black and queer sculptor of the Harlem Renaissance, was designing these beautiful sculptural pieces for public housing in New York City that queer artists and designers have brought beauty into places, sort of redistributing it from the top to everyday working class people. If you're in New York, this is actually in Brooklyn at the NYCHA Kingsborough houses. And knowing that space is, of course, of most importance. The queer bars, particularly lesbian bars, Black lesbian bars, have really been chipped away at and pushed out of cities like New Orleans here. And so people have sort of responded to that through history by creating things like this podcast series, last called the New Orleans Dyke Bar History Project, and some stage performances to kind of recreate those histories, and in like telling the stories of the 1980s and 1990s of these bars that have been pushed out by gentrification. You're also bringing queer people together in the present and sort of creating queer community today. That's a project I really admire. which, as many good projects like this, has struggled for like a lack of funding, but it's a condition that we're often in as queer designers and queer artists. I'll round out by sort of asking these questions, not to present the answers that Morgan and I came up with as the definitive ones, but that I think they're a good set of places to start from. This was sort of our 5-point agenda for design and planning for Black and queer communities. Inclusive public space, housing, particularly for queer families as opposed to straight families, which is like, when we talk about single family housing in the United States, we are talking about housing assumed for like a straight, normal family. So what is housing for queer families like, communal living situations, and how are we addressing queer youth homelessness, particularly queer youth of color homelessness through housing policy and design. Social spaces being equitable, not exclusive. Restorative justice through decarceration and abolition, knowing that people who are harmed in jails, prisons, and the carceral process, that queer people, particularly trans people, are much more likely to be harmed through those, and that they're harmful to anybody, but some of the people who are most harmed are queer. And preservation through history and memory, like we've already talked about a bit. And in the sense of like bars and other businesses often being the places where queer community is kept and regenerated year after year, knowing that the survival of those businesses is particularly important. So like thinking about how we keep those institutions going. Yeah, sort of a thought on exclusion. And when we say Black and queer, of course, those design strategies are not excluding many other people, but to shorthand it that way it is important also to note that like disability and this whole idea of design for the margins does really come from disability justice, and the importance of considering like the US and other places, of course, aren't a black and white binary, though. When I talk about whiteness, like I mentioned earlier, I'm talking about it as like a position, relative to position of power and ability to exclude. So people who are like of European descent are not the only people who are proximate or can practice whiteness. And of course, that varies a lot depending by where you are, who's in that position of power. And then I'll kind of close out with this question. Last slide. Where do you see Black and queer spaces where you are? This is an emerging field. This is a field that I'm really glad to sort of be a part of. Many people who are asking these kind of questions, but we leave these questions for y'all too, because y'all are going to be some of the people who help to answer these questions. So thank you so much for coming.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So much important work has been presented so far tonight, and I can't wait for us to dig in even deeper. Our next panelist is Amy Rosen. Amy Rosen is a socio-spatial designer at PLASTARC in New York City. They recently served as the 2018 president, the 2019 student director on the AIA National Board of Directors, and a 2020-2021 at-large representative on the AIA Strategic Council, where they served as a co-convener for the Mental Health Architecture Incubator. They were born and raised in Los Angeles and moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 2012, where they received a Bachelor of Architecture and a Master of Science in Sustainable Design from Carnegie Mellon University. Amy applies integrated design methodologies to everything they do, seeking opportunities to tie architecture into systematic and fluid urban networks to inspire, to unify, and to heal, and is especially passionate about queer space theory, efficient urban water management strategies, and innovative ways to blur the boundaries of public realms. Using their architectural education as a backbone, Amy actively incorporates equity and social sustainability into their design process. Amy further leverages a passion for data research, difference, and experimentation in order to unveil innovative design strategies that empower users and ensure a more resilient future. I'll go ahead and pass you, Amy.
Awesome. Thank you, Victor. And +1 to Chris. I did not mean to send a novel, but now that you all know who I am, I can dive right in. I'm going to talk about querying space and data analytics and the relationship between those two pieces, how we can take all the ideas that we've been noodling over in this talk and actually start to maybe apply it beyond just the end result and actually apply it to the process to get there. In particular, I always like to start with terminology and clarify where my content really sits within the realm of queerness. At the very, very beginning of all of this, there's the recognition that sex and gender are not the same thing, that sex is a term that refers to typically biological and typically reproductive attributes associated with male and female individuals. Though it's often categorized as a simplified set of polarities, there's actually 6 main karyotypes. And though it's a generally globally universal constant that is not affected by external influences, it's not static and it can be altered. Gender, on the other hand, is what actually stemmed from an acknowledgement of human difference. But unfortunately, it is oftentimes reduced down to that binary of male to female, even though it's a spectrum where people can position themselves within or against typically normalized gender terms and concepts. When I say the word polarities, it's everything from like white to black, male to female, dependent to independent, maybe even landscape to architecture, soft to hard. All of these things that are typically posed as oppositional or contradictory terms. And I think it's really important to think about polarities in the context of queer architecture and queer space, because unfortunately, our brains are actually wired to inherently process and understand things in opposition to one another. We understand something because it's exactly like something we know, or because it's the opposite. And that's just something that our brains are trained to do. And that actually leads to this convenient extremism where we can end up saying things like masculine tendencies are driving cars, are going to the gym, are shooting guns, and feminine characteristics are cleaning and taking the kids to school or doing the dishes or washing clothes. And we can make these unfortunate, really dramatic reductions of what perhaps these outlier conditions could be. And so maybe if we extend that beyond just what they do, we start to also see features and physical attributes being paired with these gender polarities, that things like ties and mustaches and muscles go with masculine, and things like high heels and makeup and bras go with feminine. And so the things don't stop there either. They can actually start to apply to space. And some quote unquote rules that we've seen emerge on the feminine side are things like social spaces, perhaps domestic spaces, or even smaller spaces. Whereas masculine spaces maybe are a little bit more modern, more elite or industrial or grand, right? You can start to see how we're stretching the limits of these reductionist exaggerations and starting to make some dangerous assumptions about our built environment. This all stems from really, as I think both Edson and Chris noted on, fear and power. The notion that perhaps it's more convenient as well as easier to accept these binaries as truth. There's only 2 options there, but that really also is just propagated by a fear of otherness and unease about something that opposes what you think to be fact. And the fact that as oppositions start to emerge as women soldiers or priests or scientists, or perhaps the idea of the first female president or the first Black president emerge, it unsettles that tendency for normalized truths and propagated stereotypes. I love that, Chris, you quoted bell hooks. I'm going to do the same. This is one of my favorite quotes by her. I think it really touches on this notion that I was just articulating, that for so long, everyone has wanted to hold on to the belief that the United States is a class-free society, that anyone who works hard enough can make it to the top. Few people stop to think that in a class-free society, there would be no top. And so when we're really thinking about how this even came to be, where this emerged, we can go all the way back to the days of really when like we had cavemen protecting or projecting what they needed to do, whereas women were protecting, and how that extended to the outside, the exterior world being where men belong and the inside being where women belong, how it even transcends into professions. Men design cities, women design interiors. And so as I go forward, I'm going to talk about this notion of otherness, that maybe the ambiguity that results from actually acknowledging exceptions to those rules can be celebrated. And we can expand this notion of a binary gender ideology into something that perhaps involves and recognizes otherness and variability. That even though it's condemned for being different from polarities, it's something that perhaps is much more inclusionary and equitable to the realities of our existence. But what does the spectrum of identity really mean? What does it look like? It is not the top of this screen. It is not simply a linear gradient. It is the bottom. It's this really complex, perhaps radial 3, 4, 5-dimensional understanding of diversity and difference, and that we don't have to be the same as the person next to us. Nor do our spaces. And so queer spaces, as we've already started to tap into, I'm citing Aaron Betsky here, that some of the characteristics of queer space are that they're actually dark and unusual and labyrinthic. And that's because they emerged as a result of queer men and women finding neglected spaces and transforming them, using them for the utilities they didn't have in the really almost curated world that was surrounding them. Things like bathhouses or alleyways or gyms and even cemeteries. One of my favorite is that virtual space can be seen as a queer space because it is so raw and social and sensorial and ephemeral. And so I've kind of just walked through a lot of the core principles of where I come from and I approach queer design. But in my work at PLASTARC, our mission is to make the world a better place, one workplace at a time. And so how do I subtly or not so subtly apply these queer ideologies into our work? How do I help to make the workplace a little bit more queer? Our process is all about data-informed design and decision-making. We believe and support this wisdom of the crowds that the average estimate is 98% more accurate than any one estimate, but it requires maybe shifting our metrics instead of quantifying such an industrial space like workplace by hard metrics like cost per person, cost per square feet. We can quantify things by people, by accessibility, ergonomics, transparency, things that maybe are looked at as soft metrics, even though they're so much more critical to our assets, to our people. When it comes to the data that we use, I like to use these collections of urban data use cases to really show that the value is driven by its utility, that in order to actually use data and apply it and make the most of it, you have to use it thoughtfully, intentionally, whether it's running predictive analytics to identify risks or providing low-income families with auditory measuring devices or any of the other examples on the screen. And that data has scale. If you're looking inside a workplace, inside a city, inside anything, you might be able to see it through particular lenses, but the data set might be small. When you're looking beyond your boundaries, you might have a huge data set, but you only really get to see it through a particular lens, either time, industry, location. And then when we're actually hearing people's sentiments, we often get into all of those lenses, but we don't have a strict foundation to really back it up. So how can we integrate all of these sources and start to really map all of these different ways of understanding, but also not falling into some of these traps? We really ferociously avoid tone-deaf decisions, analysis paralysis, where you have all this data and you don't know why or what to do with it, that maybe you are biased in one way or another, or you're simply not using it. And so in our work, we've really been, over the last couple of years, as the pandemic has literally uprooted and transformed what the workplace is, where and how people work, we're trying to rethink our own methodologies, how we take data and use an employee-first approach to workplace design. But what are those pieces? How do we bring them together? How do we look not only at surveys, but observations and even the hard data from architecture itself in order to map that ecosystem of subjective, objective, maybe large populations, small populations. But then there's also, this is where the queerness comes in, that no matter what you do, no matter how you design space, people are going to mess it up. They're going to use it how they want to use it. They're going to come in and that behavior is not always going to align. If you look at the colors on the bottom mapped to different space types, theoretically, the activities should match, but that's not what's happening here. You can see a rainbow of activity in each of these spaces. So what if instead of exploiting gender and sexuality, we actually embrace the variability of expression? We start to queer workplace and apply those queer lessons that we were looking at before, and maybe dismantle some of the power and fear dynamics within this particular industry. Some of the ways we're doing that is by integrating a recognition of individual variability as well as contextual variability. That it's so easy and so safe to be like, we want to remain objective. We want to make all of our workplace decisions around what you do, what job you have, what your role is. But what that does is actually forget and ignore the difference of your people, and it starts to create more inequitable circumstances. And the way in which you categorize people depends on that equity and inclusion. The way in which we design for people depends on that. And so our recent work has really been all about celebrating those preferences and differences and identities by combining work styles with perhaps neurodiversity and individual preferences and intentionally actually disentangling them. We're using our surveys and our interviews and all of our engagement tools to tap into both of them separately as well as together, so we can start to understand where one ends and where the other begins, and bringing in research at the same time. And that delamination is not easy, but it's so worth it because you can make smarter decisions. This slide is taking a while. And so the other piece here is not just our engagement, but how we are activating users, how you all can learn from yourselves, how you can learn from your peers. If you have a Fitbit, if you wear anything that collects data about you, that self-quant data actually gives you a granular understanding of your own difference. It tells you what you do in ways that you maybe can't see because we're blind to that. And that's how we start to dig even deeper into this understanding. And then to kind of round it out, we stop ourselves from saying whatever we've summarized is fact, that we actually invite the user back in to critique where we end up, that they themselves need to validate what we're concluding. So as I bring this to a close, I want to maybe ask this question: what if space transcended gender and sexuality constructs by allowing customization to aid in the celebration of difference? What if we recognize, in particular in our industry of workplace, that this idea of consumeration is shifting from lifestyle to workplace, that people are starting to expect customized, on-demand, tech-integrated facilities, and that we can learn from them. We can look at data, we can make the most of this time and evolve our understanding by tapping into the interaction of people in buildings. We can learn from users in a number of ways, but I want to move through, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to touch on a couple last things. On the one hand, it might not feel queer, but even changing the temperature and the lighting of your space, customizing it to yourself, is recognizing your own difference. And that in and of itself can be seen as queer. So all in all, I want to elevate the importance of occupant experience, that real estate, that buildings are not objects, they are containers for ideas and identities. And we want to leave room for hackability, right? Give people, open the door to the way in which they're going to ruin it, leave the door open to the way in which they're going to make it fit to themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Amy. So now we will jump into the Q&A section of the webinar. I provided our panelists with 3 questions beforehand. So I will kick it off with the second question that was provided to you all, and then I'll limit it to just that question and see if there are any questions in the chat being sent or any hands being raised wanting to ask any questions. And if there isn't, then I'll jump back to the other 2 questions that I provided. So the first question is, queer spaces smash through the spaces that challenge cis heteronormative morals, sheltering lives that seek to live their own truths. What is your criticism of the oftentimes general statement that is, you can't design for gender and sexuality in architecture? The built form does not manifest gender or sexuality. Open to all 3 of you.
I don't want to necessarily start us off because I was just talking for a while. But I feel like what I just presented hits on that point exactly, Victor, that it's a myth that it doesn't, that oftentimes people who say that fit the mold and that they oftentimes are served by that space. Therefore, they don't see the holes in it. They don't see the lack of service and the inequities, right? It's a recognition that if we design with any kind of systematic approach that is uniform, that is one size fits all, that is operationalized and efficient, chances are we're forgetting about somebody, or we're optimizing for, like, who are we optimizing for? Who is welcome in that space? And it might not always be as clear as black and white, women, men, but all in all, it does come down to a lot of those identity factors.
I think also to add to that is that I take sort of criticality with that second myth that you were mentioning, Victor, about the built form does not manifest gender or sexuality. I completely disagree with that. Of course, like as you're saying, this is kind of what people are often saying, and I did not talk about it in my lecture or in my talk, but then you can see all throughout history how gender is really embedded in a lot of built spaces and landscapes and so on. And so it's just that people are ignoring it, and that then they are rendered invisible. And that's why when we are then looking at designing for gender and sexuality, then we don't necessarily think of that because it has been rendered invisible. And that's precisely like my example of the queer space, for example, in the Philippines, is that because the roundabout was designed to accommodate sort of the government agencies, that doesn't mean that it cannot be used, let's say, by queer folks, and they have appropriated it. And so I think there's also the difference between the intent, or it's the kind of original intent of the space, and Amy was talking about this earlier, that this ability to, I love, Amy, like what you said about like the hackability of the space, because I think that was exactly like what the for example, the sex workers were doing. They hacked this public space as a place for their work. And so I think that's this ability to be able to really sort of subvert the space. And so, yes, I think, built form does manifest gender and sexuality.
I think I'm going to respond almost adjacent to this question, because I don't think I can really add much more than those 2 amazing answers. But I'm going to try and complicate it a little bit, bringing in maybe more of a political perspective too, which is, well, the built form may or may not manifest gender or sexuality, but the priorities of a society that creates conditions for, again, back to the issue of like queer youth homelessness or the incarceration of trans people, or anyone. That society is a society that we can design and develop and build and make policy away from, because current built environment, current policy upholds this unjust society that we live in. And so, as has already been said very emphatically, like, there is a status quo, there is a mold. Many of the people who are currently making decisions are the ones for whom that was designed, or in order to gain positions of power within the system, people who may not fit into that mold have adopted the priorities of the people who do. So yeah, we need to challenge that. And one thing I love about queerness is a like design and organizing strategy is that it can, and this is true of all kinds of marginalized identities, but queerness is the one I happen to actually have, is how subversive it can be, and how sly and sometimes disguised and like hidden queerness can be, as again, everyone's talked about quite a lot. So you can be looking at a seemingly insurmountable condition or obstacle, and yeah, I mean, I think of like to use a kind of like a classic queer design example, like the Aids quilt, which I guess people may or may not know about, but like the concept of the Aids quilt was like, how can we possibly commemorate the hundreds of thousands of people who died of AIDS? So many would say like were killed by government inaction during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, 1990s, and which is still ongoing today. And some queer artists and designers came together and were like, well, what if we made these individual quilt patches and then just collected them from the families of everyone who was affected by AIDS until they can like cover the National Mall? And they literally did that. And it sounds like such a outlandish, ridiculous thing to do, but because like queerness is community, by going to the queer communities in all these different places around the country, they were able to pull together all of these pieces, and using this like, this artistic form that is easily transportable and is kind of collage based already, created this design response that when it's all put together can in some way address the enormity of the loss of the AIDS epidemic. And I think that that's a really inspiring example to me.
Yeah, I think oftentimes when I hear like this very narrow statement about how it isn't manifested into the bill form, it goes back to the sense of community and mutual aid that helped form a lot of the neighborhoods throughout some of the major cities in the United States. And that's just like one of several other examples of how that manifestation actually comes through that sexuality and identity. And then again, circling it back to how queerness is just based off of community. And a lot of that comes from that neglection that is obviously a societal issue. But yeah, I just thought it was important to bring up the question so we could really dig deep as far as like how that in itself is a narrow-ended perception of things.
Victor, I don't know if there's time, but I just realized we didn't touch on one other thing that I think is really critical, that I think we haven't touched on language and how we actually measure space and how we talk about architecture. And I think it's really dangerous, but unfortunately easy to use data points that are exclusionary and inherently oppressive, that the way in which we track and measure space and experience and people might not even include the layers of identity that we're talking about here, that typically we reduce gender to the binaries, right? We have no data points pointing to those that are non-binary or otherwise. And it's that lack of data, that lack of visibility, not just to the community, but who they are, and that they are points in this scatter plot of a population, that they're just invisible from a actual metric standpoint. And that's a really big problem that is complex and institutionalized, and it's going to take some further dismantling to get into that.
I'd also like to add to Victor your earlier point about that the question about the built form does not manifest gender or sexuality. I always point out also the bathroom or the toilet. You know, it's very clear that there's like a male and female toilet. Like if anybody sort of disagrees that that gender is not manifested in space, like, okay, then why do we have like a male and female bathroom or toilet? I mean, very simple, but yet, as Amy, you're saying also, like the bathroom or the toilet is so complex and so contested. So that's a good example, I think.
In a historical sense too, like why did the floors of the House and Senate not have a woman's bathroom for generations until I think like the 1960s? That's a clear manifestation of gender in the built environment.
I will go ahead and give, I know we're at 3 minutes over, so I wanted to ask one more time to everybody on the call, if you have any questions, feel free to ask away. Either raise a hand or you could send it in the chat, or else I will have to jump into one of my more boring questions.
None of them are boring.
It's going twice. Okay, I'll ask away this last question just to make sure that we're respectful of your guys' time. Architectural canon that is taught in universities is extremely narrow and exclusionary. Much of what is taught is fiction, is as much a fiction as a truth. It excludes and denies parts of the reality of human experience. Would you be able to share a moment that each of you made you come to this realization and how it led you into the work that you are currently developing? So in short, it's kind of asking what made you realize that there was a piece of your identity not being reflected in what was taught related to architectural education, and how that void helped you pursue what you currently developed in your work.
I think for me, when I was studying architecture back in the 90s, when I was in college, that I think Victor already alluded to that when I was specifically studying history, is that then I quickly saw that my identity was not in there, particularly because we were studying a lot of European American sort of histories, and Filipino architecture, for example, was really neglected. That was one part. But the other part of it was that then I did not see any queer architect or designer being discussed, nor they actually talked about gender or sexuality, as you pointed out earlier, being manifested in architecture. That was just completely ignored. So for me, that was like the point of my realization, that then why is it that then in kind of the studying of history of architecture, that did not exist, or it was invisible, or it was sort of ignored, and it was considered an other, as Amy was pointing out earlier. So for me, that was it. And so because of that, that's why I went into kind of my master's, then eventually my PhD. The case study that I was talking about, that was a paper that I did, and others. And so for me, that was kind of the crucial point. And I think for me also now as an educator, that's also part of my advocacy, is that then to be able to uncover those histories in my research, to talk about then how they are part of the history of architecture in the built environment. So for me, that was a sort of the gap that I saw in my own study, and that's what led me to my own research and teaching right now.
I love that story, Edson, and I love this question. I'm sure we all, at least those of us who identify as queer or have challenged these, have like a few moments that come to mind. And like I jumped back to architecture school, where I did my undergrad thesis in queer architecture and queer space. A lot of the research I shared today came from that thesis, and that stemmed from me not understanding why I didn't connect with anything I was being taught, not understanding why I didn't feel safe or welcome in the spaces or in the theories that were being shared with me. That it was almost like the systems that were being taught to us, the Vitruvian man, the rules and metrics, the distances that were taught, it was all so regimented, and I just felt so dangerously like a bull in a china shop, like that I was going to ruin this perfect mold of what architecture was. And it was like unsettling and uncomfortable, and I had no idea like what to do about it. So then I started to push back, and I did my thesis, and I started out by like trying to understand what feminine architecture was. That was before I realized I was queer and before I realized I was non-binary, and that I didn't understand I was opposing this patriarchal mold of architecture by actually just reinforcing it by going to the opposite end. And so I was like, how do I completely unlearn everything I've learned and like mess up my own understanding? And I started to get messier. And then by the end of it, I got pretty aggressive, and I like talked to the head of our school, and I was like, we are not taught in a way that encourages difference and creativity. Like the way in which our pedagogy is structured actually reinforces these principles of oppression from day one. And it was pretty bold of me, but I was fifth year and I was like, fuck it. Sorry for language. And so at that point, the head of the school literally asked me like, what would you do? And I did not see that coming. I didn't think I would ever be asked. I thought I would be like, oh, Amy, you're you, but everybody else loves it. But the fact that like, if we speak up and advocate, that they might ask you for an alternate is an incredible argument for student advocacy and student voices. And I basically told them, I was like, instead of teaching us the distances and the rules and the boxes and the squares in first semester studio, maybe give them something to play with, like give them clay, give them a malleable material to create space. Don't give them a ruler and a protractor, give them something that enables that self-expression. And they did it, and people didn't necessarily like it, but it forced them to like think outside the box. And I think it's really, I love the opportunity that students have to question what they're taught and to push the boundaries, because I think we have more agency in school than we do anywhere else. So take it if you can, and try to do the same.
Man, that was so inspiring. I have I guess a worse story, which I guess kind of speaks to like, as a white man, I had, and who like I did my thesis on like architecture education as a tool for educating against white supremacy. So like, there's a lot of racist white men who have been architects, who are currently architects, but particularly who are in the canon of architects, right? One prime example is Philip Johnson, who was the first gay architect I ever learned about. And so I went through this like arc of like, learned about Philip Johnson when I was a kid, because I'm from Texas and he has a lot of big buildings there. And then when I went to college, I was like, oh my God, he was gay. I'm gay. He's gay. And then I was like, oh, wait, he was a huge racist and a Nazi. And like, also did all this architecture for like these huge capitalist racist institutions. And those things are all tied together. And as much as he spent his entire career saying like, oh, I got over it, it was like a youthful dalliance. Like, no, it's not. Like, I had been through like organizing work that I've done here in New Orleans, like in all these spaces around like respectable white supremacists, like particularly specifically people who are trying to oppose the removal of Jim Crow era Confederate monuments. And I see that like some of those people are in the same sorts of professional spaces as architects who want to uphold the histories and legacies of these people like Philip Johnson. And I see architects, often Black, femme, queer, like Mitch McEwen, trying to get Philip Johnson's name removed from the galleries at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City when the Black Reconstruction Collective did their exhibit there a couple years ago. And of course, the institution fights that because they're like, well, he's an important part of our history. We can't just take him off the wall. But I feel like for me, as a white man who has an ability to say things and get hurt for saying it, and I kind of challenge other white people on this call too, to kind of think about that, both for the sake that it's true, but also in a way where like, we can't just go say things willy-nilly. We have to do it in ways that are accountable to the communities that we're a part of. But we do need to be active in those, advocating for those changes, because we can't just leave it up to Black advocates, other advocates of color for changing these curriculum, for changing the curriculum and changing the canon. We have to call that shit out too, because we can't train more white supremacist architects. Like, we know the consequences of that. It's in the world all around us now, and we have to be working against that every way we can.
Thank you guys for answering that question. I think related, the entire purpose for the webinar was to help provide that insight, that there's more beyond what we are taught, and just showing a glimpse of what someone's identity may be able to pursue within the design realm. And I think all three of you provided great insight, and the work that you all have done is really inspiring and wonderful. So I appreciate you all for bringing that to us. I think we are well over time, so I do apologize for us going over, but I think this was an amazing conversation that hopefully will continue future AIAS Pride webinars and discussions that help stimulate our minds and way of thinking. So I think this is where we will call it to a close. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us today and giving us some of your time.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, AIAS
Thanks,
folks.
Victor.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Victor. This was a really good webinar. We definitely need to keep doing stuff like this.